We are going to start Chapter 4 with the final note on Chapter 3. Socrates is introduced, though not in a straightforward way. The message here was, this is me paraphrasing the final note, by the way, or not paraphrasing, rather, summarizing and commenting. It's a commentary on a commentary. Honesty can replace hierarchy, but only in the ideal city. Therefore, the laws of Athens require an enforced contract, whereas those of the Republic do not. Matters are obviously more complex than that, so let's see what Strauss will make of the Socratic school in this chapter of Unclassical Natural Right. And this is going to be a multi-part video, as was the chapter before this one and the chapter before that one. There's simply a lot to talk about. So it starts with the idea that Socrates called down philosophy from the heavens. And to the extent that this is true, he founded political philosophy in so doing in natural right teaching. Yet, in the previous chapter, there appears to be mention of pre-Socratic natural right. And it's not entirely certain what was meant by that remark about pre-Socratic natural right, but there might have been something. I don't know. I'm not too familiar with the ancients, so I'll leave that to the good scholars in my comment section to figure out. Strauss makes a distinction that will inform the rest of the book, Socratic versus modern natural right, which is to say the Platonists versus the contractualists, quote-unquote. And it's funny that the previous chapter did end with some sort of Socratic contractualism. That's a lot of isms and icks and things thrown together, but there was. Let me get the note here. I do have it. Yes, the final statement of Chapter 3. Only allegiance to an inferior community can be derivative from contract. Such is the nature of most Socratic dialogues. An honest man always keeps his promises, regardless of whom he makes them to. This sounds like the end of the Republic, a simple appeal to an appeal to simple morality, quote unquote, painting the philosopher as a saintly sage. Of course, the philosopher knows exactly which promises he has to make and to whom they must be made in order for him to be able to remain a philosopher in relative peace. So that's what I mean by Socratic contractualism, is this stuff about the credo and laws and covenant with the laws of Athens and so on. So here alright, Socratic versus modern natural right. So there is mention of some sort of contract pertaining to Socrates' philosophy in the previous chapter, but this is obviously a more defining trait of the modern natural right philosophers. And in making this distinction of classics versus moderns, he lumps in the Christians with the Socratic school, which, if you're taking the approach of classic versus modern, I guess that's fair enough, but I wouldn't say that's doctrinally accurate, obviously. I don't think it's the first time he does that. I think there's maybe we've gone over that before, where there's this enumeration of, or this sort of genealogy of teachers, so to speak, and he just basically, no, I think he does that in the next chapter on John Locke, or at least chapter that starts with John Locke, or perhaps it was with John Locke, and he enumerates all of the teachers, and he traces this back to Socrates, even though Hooker, which was Locke's teacher, was a student of Aquinas, or something like that. But okay. Understanding classical natural right doctrine would require an appreciation, says Strauss, of Socrates' innovation in classical thought, which we do not have. So, I guess we're not going to understand it then. So there's an implication in the precise wording of it, is that we as moderns do not have it. So we as moderns inevitably end up with the conclusion that the change was a certain shift in focus from the natural world to human beings. But Cicero already had that thought before we did. So Was his conclusion likewise inevitable? Did he lack proper insight as we do? Did he lack this appreciation of the innovation of Socrates' doctrines in his context? I don't know what that sentence means, but it's just one of those Straussian things where it's just, now we're going to do this, but we can't do this, and we're inevitably going to do this other thing, and then that conflicts with something else. It's like, great. Strauss says that Socrates was not a conventionalist himself, but identified law with nature and the legal with the just. This requires unpacking. First of all, none of these statements are simply true, and Strauss taught me that. One example that springs to mind is Socrates' concession to Thrasymachus that good is separate from the legal. Now, that might still leave the just available as coeval with the legal, but that is only the premise according to which the ideal regime can be intelligible, or just, or whatever. And Socrates' effort to establish the just city in speech was not an attempt to write policy or even a treatise or whatever, but to teach a lesson about political ambition to Glaucon, and, well, Glaucon especially. But also Adeimantus. The only place where law and nature coincide for Socrates is really within the soul, perhaps some sort of ideal city, but really in terms of a virtuous order within the soul, sort of regime of the soul, as it were. And sure enough, Strauss follows suit by more or less reversing those earlier statements, saying that Socrates and all the classics still maintained the distinction between the legal and the just in order to maintain a moral reference point. Maybe that's not quite a reversal. So, law, nature, conventional, just. But there is... Yeah, maybe there's something like truly just and the humanly just. I think that's something that's going to come up. But anyway, the distinction that is also made between natural right and legal right, and between natural and human... natural and human morality. And I take this to mean that, according to such a notion, sharing a meal might be proper, humanly speaking, though the person who prepared that meal and acquired the resources for the meal naturally deserves all of it. Thus there is political virtue and genuine virtue. This sounds more or less like my conclusion that Socrates seemed to think that there were at least principles of proper order in politics, though such an order is necessarily more tolerant to imperfection than the proper order within the soul, which is a proper pursuit of wisdom or something like that. The teaching, practically speaking, was something like a good politician might want this and that and have to do so and so, but a thoughtful mensch cares for none of these things and just wants to pursue wisdom and virtue and so on. Eudaimonia. Of course, there's a whole different approach, but we're just going to limit ourselves to Socrates here and the classics. He says that the institutions of the Republic are natural but taboo. I take it he means the example of, unisex armies and gyms. And we have to keep in mind that this particular institution is basically a meme, or joke, or whatever. Yeah, it is a meme because it's a reference to Aristophanes, basically, according to Strauss. The Aristophanes play called the Women's Assembly or something like that. It's certainly meant to evoke laughter. Certainly Aristophanes' play was, because it's Aristophanes, but Plato had something going on with poetry and the comics. And I mean, it's ridiculous because the explicit logical premise of that entire institution is that the difference between a man and a woman is the length of their hair. Remember, the Greeks worked out fully naked. Even in gyms today, where people are about 40% naked, I think any healthy man will get the joke, to put it that way. And then there's the issue of natural slavery. In terms of natural right to freedom, or right to... Yeah, I don't know, I just put that note in, but I forgot what Strauss's words were. but the issue of natural slavery is raised, and that's very relevant today in terms of the IQ conversation and so on. Oh, and there's footnotes. Oh goodness, I don't have the book here. I guess I'm just going to go and fetch the book, and then I'll go. Great. We're already 10 minutes in, and I haven't even gotten to the first thing yet. Okay. Yeah, just bear with me, okay. Footnote, page 121. Okay, here we go. Oh man, that's a lot of footnotes. Right, okay, now we can... Here we go. Aristotle could not explain what money is except by distinguishing between natural wealth and conventional wealth. He could not explain what slavery is except by distinguishing between natural slavery and legal slavery. Alright, so that's sort of the idea of, human justice and what natural justice is, saying that there's... So that raises the issue of natural slaves, meaning that, yeah, we're all equal by law, but some of us aren't equal by nature, so we're going to have to respectfully, put these people in our little, I don't know what, we have to gently teach these people how to write code or something. Okay. So what's the footnote here? It's numero tres. So we're going to go to the Republic now. This is such a disaster. This video is going to be such a disaster. Okay, that's 452. No, 456. I'm like dyslexic or something. Put on some music. This might take a while. Okay, yeah, that's a bit about gymnastic. Men and women. There it is. Therefore, have the same nature with respect to guarding a city, except insofar as one is weaker and the other stronger. Must choose to live in guard with such men, since they are competent and akin to the men in their nature, except that it was just established that they're weaker, so what? It's not music and gymnastic to the women's guardians. Given laws that are possible, or like prayers, making a woman fit for guarding, produce men. Yeah, so there's basically like this haphazardly sort of symbolizing men and women in kind of a rhetorical hurry. And they do this by carrying forth this fixation on the arts, and how the arts are this sort of, as an artisan you're this, and insofar you're the artisan, you're this, and so it doesn't matter when you're a man or a woman, because when you're practicing the art of guarding, it's like you're the same nature because you are the artisan that guards, and so on. So it's sort of this what would you say? It's this clinical, surgically precise, technological feature of civilization that is being exaggerated and being made ridiculous by acting as if there's no difference between men and women and so on, with respect to military service, and they're just like able to strip naked together because what? They're both soldiers. What are you looking at? These are my soldier parts. And then it's 452. Even to the men inside, no one is also. Yeah, all right. I basically did this whole thing for nothing, so that's great. Yeah, it's just it's. I think I've basically said it all just there. But okay, at least I have the book and I have Plato here, so I can read more important footnotes later. Let's see how much time has passed. Oh man, this took 5 minutes. That's embarrassing. Okay, so Socrates' project was to discover the intelligible being of human things, the ratio rerum humanarum, which is the rationality of human things. Now Strauss says that in order to grasp this, one must see the difference between human versus divine things. Why quote-unquote divine? What does that mean? Does that mean the heavenly bodies? Because, I mean, Socrates called philosophy down from the heavens, but the heavens to the philosophers at the time were understood as, meteor belt, basically. Not very divine at all. He further specifies that Socrates studies the human order insofar it is not reducible to divine or natural things. What does divine reductionism look like? I've been accused of something of the sort recently, but I don't know, maybe divine reductionism is like what? It's like women get angry when the moon is in a certain position or something. I don't know. Socratic science is a study of the whole, but the study of the whole is through that of beings, and beings as bounded, intelligible units. This is important. Thus the whole is itself not simply a being, but something beyond the sum of its parts. The whole is partially understood in observing the beings and their relations. Beings are to be understood as ends and not as products. The production is understood in light of the product, and the proper goal is the product, and the proper goal of the product most of all. So that means that the poetic baggage of philosophy, the concern for first things, which Strauss sort of brought up to show how philosophy sort of adopted from poetry, and that might still be true in different ways. The idea of nature apparently was first coined by Homer, which I thought was an interesting thing that I learned from a friend. But so that means that the poetic baggage of philosophy, the concern for first things, is apparently in some way dropped, in the sense that Socrates considers not the uniform chaos in a process of becoming apparently different from that stratum, let's say, of chaos, but the different things as they are and as they do. So the question is not the chicken or the egg, or the chicken or the egg, but rather, what is a good chicken? What is a virtuous chicken? Certainly poetry concerns itself with the visible and human things and with their proper ends also. In commentaries on the Republic, there's this issue of poetry being an art. What kind of art is it? It's the art of meaning in the sort of the Petersonian sense. It's, these stories are about what we do and so on. I think that's Alan Bloom in his essay in this translation of the Republic, who talks about poetry being the art of using, the user's art. So the artisan makes a shoe, but the poet writes about the shoe and about the beauty of the shoe and the goodness of the shoe and so on. Beginnings is the subject of myth, but the heroic stories have a great amount of moral teachings also. That follows, I guess, from what I just said. It's funny how I have random thoughts and then they sort of sometimes link with the notes that come afterwards. That's how I try to write them anyway. Because philosophy begins with the visible world, there can be a science of chickens, aka biology, as distinct from a political science. Because Socrates did not inquire into first things, but things visible to us, he had to tackle opinions about things, because these often inform our knowledge before any personal observation, which is to say, there's these visible things, but before you even see them, you already think something about them, probably. and this was his dialectical practice. Now, it must be stressed that dialectics are a friendly conversation. Not everyone can engage in dialectics with anyone. Greekness was a beginning for Socrates. He did not talk to barbarians. He and his friends approached them armed. But aside from being limited by the city in terms of its borders, there is also the issue of the city itself. The Socratic dialogues are dialogues between people who are in different respects unequal. They differ in wisdom, intention, and in terms of their hierarchy in the city. So Socrates might be wiser and more virtuous than some of these men he speaks to, but they have some kind of authority over him, so he has to be careful with them. But what is true at any rate is that opinions differ, and a natural common ground must be discovered in dialectics. In the dialogues, the outcome often involves some sort of concession to convention, which is why I brought up the hierarchy of the city, because he can't simply just say anything. There is a deference, for instance, to inspiration in the Meno, and to conventional justice in the Republic, etc. Even in many of these cases, the final solution can reveal the way in which the faulty initial opinions were able to contribute, and hence how we are capable of being partially right about things. And the explicit term that Strauss uses is how we can divine truth, or something like that, which is a very pregnant term. Again, this word divine comes back. And I don't know what it is precisely. I don't know what Strauss means by it. His use of it is probably informed by the classics. I don't know, let's continue. Strauss gets to the point here. Natural right could be something that requires cultivated understanding through dialectics. We can say that our laws are just, but if we critically examine each other, we will be forced to admit the ways in which we contradict the thing that we still suspect is something that we could grasp. So in other words, you could be wrong, but there's something you're wrong about. And insofar you know that that thing exists, you're at least partially right about it to that extent. We must note that there are several Socratic dialogues, however, that are operatic. There would have to be a certain practical comfort with limited knowledge of natural right. Dialectics, of course, also require philosophers, and hence the right circumstances for philosophy. Presumably, these philosophers would then have to act publicly to a great degree, unless their search for natural right remains something limited to esoteric statements and written exchanges, which would then be picked up by liberally educated elites, who would then go into politics and try to sort of unite heaven and earth, so to speak. I think that's the idea. So Strauss explains how dialectics are supposed to work according to this Platonic scheme here. Any knowledge about anything presupposes some kind of awareness of the whole, be it conscious or otherwise. This is a Platonic axiom, and one that we do not necessarily hold to today, at least not when we start defending our contemporary leftist outlook. In order for cultural relativism to be a fully metaphysical reality, not just a human one, we have to shy away from any notion of solid realism. In our view today, we must indeed do so because even if an intelligible reality existed, its access to us is limited to a rule of thumb, namely that no one truly knows anything and therefore cannot force his ideas on others, unless it is this maxim that is being enforced, as this is the greatest knowable good for man, which is freedom and equality. And equality and freedom and equality, and so on. Realism was a noble classical superstition at best, and certainly a white modern arrogance. So what would be the alternative to the idea that the mind is fundamental and has vision of reality? The alternative is a sort of constant, ever-changing actuality, which is different for everyone and knowable as being such because history and humanity reveal a great variety of plausible alternatives, though capitalism, being a white modernism and hence burdened with its respective baggage, is emphatically not one of those alternatives. This is because if every experience of reality is equal, any difference in suffering is unacceptable, since no one can lay claim on any kind of hierarchy, and capitalism sort of naturally forms hierarchies or unnaturally forms hierarchies, and therefore there's this inequality in life and suffering and so on, and that's unacceptable according to this metaphysical democracy, so to speak. So affiliation with group and suffering of the group replace responsibility and virtue, because responsibility and virtue is sort of a model of like, okay, there's this thing out there where there is divine law or natural excellence that human beings can attain through effort and cultivated reason and so on. There's that absolute thing whether when relativism is true, then our concrete reality is what matters most, and our experience of that reality is what makes us human, and we're in that respect all equal, and whatever natural affiliations we have is our groups, and the goal, really, the eudaimonia, is peace of mind brought about through monetary well-being. Perhaps it's plausible, but I cannot deny outright that reality. I cannot deny outright that reality is non-divine and of a non-intelligent origin and constituency. But the final conclusions of said thought process, I do have to say, are arbitrary and attempt to restore some kind of seemingly beneficial shadow of classical ethics. So anyway, if the axiom is accepted, then it seems that any claim of any society on reality is not simply different from another, but in contradiction to both. Excuse me, let's try that again. Anyway, if the Platonic axiom is accepted, then it seems that any claim of any society on reality is not simply different from another, but in contradiction to it. Both may be able to rebut key assumptions of either, but the final result leaves one to suspect that the truth corresponds to neither, or at least not fully to either, of the propositions in question. Perhaps the discussion will illuminate certain apparent strengths or weaknesses in a given worldview, but it is doubtful that any eventual synthesis will itself be comprehensive and lucid. This does not render irrelevant the actual truth, however, and there is hence no excuse to impose outright practical limitations on philosophy. For without truth, any theory bearing on things within such self-imposed limits is equal to any other conceivable theory. Therefore, the preferable theory in such a condition would be the beneficial one, which means that monetary benefit would become the universal good for a human natural right to resolve the meaning crisis. Many of us still want to try doing this again. I don't doubt we will, if given enough time. Now something interesting happens. Having established the Platonic axiom, Strauss says that conventionalism despises opinion and appeals to nature. For this reason, besides others, Socrates had to prove natural right on those terms, which is that the terms of nature versus convention. And he says based on facts, not speeches. Sounds like Weber. Facts don't care about your speeches. It is interesting that Strauss implies that there might have been other approaches Socrates could have conceived of. Woods, I suppose, the Latin conjunction would be Socrate when you're speaking to Socrates or something. I don't know. No, it's a sort of subjective form, maybe. I don't know. I really don't know. But it's interesting that there might have been other approaches Socrates would have taken to establish natural right. For instance, if his opponent would have been, I don't know, whatever guy, like a poet maybe, then Socrates would have had to prove natural right on, I don't know, like, he would have had to employ rhetoric, for instance. if he was speaking to a politician or whatever. So something like that. I don't know. Strauss says that this confirms Socrates' thesis, namely that the conventionalists, in rejecting the city, are appealing to reality, and Socrates must therefore try to negotiate a common ground, which is them trying to go beyond opinion, but while holding the opinion that there is something, beyond opinion. It's another opinion, and therefore it has to be put against this other thing, and then conversation happens, and that's how it works. So I'll end with a final footnote on page 126, Plato, the Republic. Oh, my bookmark just fell out. That's great. These moments, they're everyone's favorite moments where they can relax and not have to listen to my stupid accent, which is really thick in this video for some reason. Okay. 358 E3. Okay. That's where. 358 E. Oh. Okay. Let's see what this footnote belongs to. What statements this is for. I don't see it. They had to prove it by appeal to the facts as distinguished from the speeches. And this is 350. Oh, I'm in 458, right? So, yeah, they were talking about dirty stuff there. I wasn't so sure whether that was germane to the point that I was going towards here. Okay, most of all I said Socrates, what would an intelligent man enjoy talking and hearing about? Well, oh, I just closed it. Oh man, this is such a disaster. Most of all, I said, what would an intelligent man enjoy talking and hearing about more again and again? What you say is quite fine, he said. Glaucon said. Now listen to what I said I was going to tell first, what justice is and where it came from. They say that doing injustice is naturally good and suffering injustice bad, but the bad in suffering injustice far exceeds the good in doing it, so that when they do injustice to one another and suffer it, in taste of both, it seems profitable to those who are not able to escape the one and choose the other, to set it down a compact among themselves, neither to do injustice nor to suffer it. What do you mean? What does that have to do with facts? So what? Oh, I think there's something there. All right. So what? There's some sort of appeal to the empirically provably preferability of doing injustice, even though. Okay, so there's the speeches that doing justice is better than doing injustice. And that's why the just is good. But if you try to live this way, you would see that the benefit from doing injustice outweighs the pain of suffering the injustice of others. Is that it? I don't know. 376, no, 67, B, 2 to 5. I don't know if I'm even reading this right. I'm somewhat not used to navigating these things. Here we go. But here, just frequently turn their powers up. But I, for I need hide nothing from you out of my desire to hear the opposite from you. Speak as families. Now, don't only show us by the argument that justice is stronger than injustice, but show what each in itself does to the man who has it that makes the one bad and the other good. And take away the reputations, as Glaucon told you to. Okay. So, there we go. So don't, again, not the speeches, not the praises, but show that injustice is naturally not better than justice. Then there's 369, a 5 to 6. So then perhaps there would be more justice in a bigger, and it would be easier to observe closely if you want. First we'll investigate what justice is like. It's like in the others, what justice is like in the cities, then we'll also go on to consider it in individuals, considering the likeness of the bigger in the idea of the littler. You satisfies me, so if we should watch the city coming into being, the speech, we also see its justice coming into being. Okay, so this is, again, sort of an empirical tone, even though they're only talking about cities, but, so yeah. Observe what justice is like in the cities in order to determine whether it's preferable, I guess. So there's this reference to facts, I guess. Oh man, my neck is killing me. Okay, so then here's, now what about this? Must each of them put his work at the disposition of all in common? For example, must the farmer, one man, provide food for 4 and spend 4 times as much time and labor in the provision of food and then give it in common to the others? Or must he neglect them and produce a 4th part of the food in a 4th part of the time and use the other 3 parts for the provision of house clothing and shoes? So, okay, so they're defaulting to concrete examples and not just appealing to what is praised and what is not, I suppose. Something like that. Yeah, that seems to be about this, the schwung of this thing. She's 70A. Yeah, it's basically just that is. I mean, it's the way people talk about politics, really, at any time. Certainly today, where there's a policy that's being proposed, and it's not projected on necessarily on the. Well, I mean, racism is sort of like the new, let's say, the new. Whatever was praiseworthy in the time of Socrates, you know, is like what serving in the army, bringing lots of sacrifices, whatever it was, you know, it's basically like. But mostly when we talk about policies, at least on the right, when policies are talked about, there's this reference to data, you know, and that's what they're doing here, sort of. I mean, they're trying to have these concrete examples and not trying to, you know, determine what is noble, but what is effective or beneficial, and that's that comes from this concession to nature, to the conventionalists, trying to go on their ground and saying like, okay, so what's beneficial? Because we're dropping the speeches, right? So we're trying to look at the rational. Correct arrangement of the city, and that's how we're going to rebut the conventionalists through, from the perspective of rationalism. We're going to instead establish this correct city rather than having this morality or whatever. I think it's something like that, and that's all I got, because from there on out. Oh wait, here's an interesting sentence. No, wait, there. Yeah, so what? So what? Yeah. Yeah, I think I might have, I'm confused. Okay, well, anyway, a good note to end on is, I mean, that footnote was just basically extra. That's what confused me. But the note that we ended on was that this idea of dialectics and how Socrates' disagreement with the conventionalists is basically kind of a proof of how dialectics is possible. And well, I suppose it doesn't altogether prove that it's desirable, but I mean, just look at what happens. The conversation will continue, presumably, in the next video.